A very good evening to you all, and let me share with you clinician and a clinical approach to neonatal respiratory distress. And this would give you a bird's eye view of how one would approach a newborn with respiratory distress. Well, the story begins when you see a sick newborn. For here, your first uh, apprehension would be, is there a life-threatening event? And when we talk about, is there a life-threatening event, we are talking about, is there an apnea, bradycardia, bradypnea, or cyanosis? If you find one or more of these, obviously, you would skip your evaluation and move to life-saving measures. So essentially, your assessment is about what you see and what you hear in the first contact with the newborn. Mind you, this clinical assessment is far superior to any technology, and the information that you would gain would be far more. And in the first few seconds, without use of any equipments, but the most sophisticated tool that you have, which is located between your 2 ears, you would be able to make out huge set of information. So what you see and what you hear is primarily trying to make out what I call it as CBC. Well, CBC is not about complete blood count. It is about having a structured and organized approach to evaluation of the newborn. And by this, I mean consciousness, breathing, and color. When you look at consciousness, what you are trying to gauge is how is the tone, cry, activity, and sensorium of this newborn. Essentially, it is telling us huge information about the perfusion of the brain. When you are assessing breathing, when just a glance and look is what is telling you about the rate and work of breathing. And obviously, you are also keen to hear any uh, auditory sounds. Is there a wheeze? Is there a stridor? Is there a grunt? For it would help you to identify and grade the severity of the illness. And last but not the least, color, which has not much significance in the delivery room, but thereafter, a pink color is assuring, a dusky color is a cause of worry, and cyanosis, as we said, is a medical emergency. So in the first contact, you have quickly visualized and heard what this newborn is telling you. And this CBC tells you three important key features. Consciousness is telling you the perfusion of the brain, breathing is telling you the perfusion of the lungs, and color is telling you about integrity of the cardiovascular and the respiratory system. So essentially, this CBC is in the first glance telling you, is the newborn uh, well or sick, and if sick, whether it is primarily which system which is involved. So the next question that you need to ask as you observe this newborn is it primarily a respiratory, a circulatory, or a combined pathology? Simply because you would realize that predominantly either it is respiratory insufficiency or circulatory insufficiency or in combination that would end up with cardiopulmonary failure and or cardiopulmonary arrest. So when you have a look at these, what we are talking about is what is the respiratory rate, how is the chest indrawing. You would now auscultate and check for the breath sounds, the air entry, look at the sensorium, and last but not least, interpret looking at the oxygen saturation. This will give you an idea of whether it is a primary respiratory pathology or not. However, simultaneously, you need to assess also the circulatory arm of our clinical assessment, and you would focus here quickly on the heart rate, the capillary fill time, the peripheral pulses, the core axillary temperature, blood pressure, and the urine output. So this cardiorespiratory assessment rapidly tells you whether it is essentially a respiratory, a circulatory, or a combined cardiorespiratory problem. What else? It is not enough to say there is respiratory distress. We need to grade the severity, and the respiratory pathology, we would grade it in terms of respiratory distress or respiratory failure. The shock, we would say in terms of compensated shock or hypotensive shock. So uh, what we are trying to do is also identify where exactly is this problem arising from? For example, if you have a stridor, we know it's an upper airway obstruction. If you have a wheeze, it's a lower airway obstruction. A grunt tells you it's an alveolar pathology, and chest indrawing, especially intercostal indrawing, tells you it's a parenchymal pathology. And this will help you to anatomically localize what is the site of lesion in this newborn. And last but not the least, it's not enough to say so this syndromic approach will help you identify whether it's a well newborn or a sick newborn, whether it's a respiratory or a circulatory problem, and you would be able to grade in terms of whether it's respiratory distress or respiratory failure. You need to ask, why did this problem occur? And for this, you need to ask three questions. What is the gestation? It's a term or a preterm, for we will soon realize that the etiology, the clinical course, the severity will vary a lot. The age of onset, we would soon realize that there are few respiratory disorders which happen in the first few hours, while some would happen late onset. And again, your differential diagnosis will differ. And last but not the least, the same problem but with different risk factors, intrapartum, maternal, perinatal, will help come down to narrowing down of a differential diagnosis. So if I have to put all that we just said, a glance of approaching a newborn with respiratory distress, just have a look at this newborn. So first we said, is there a life-threatening event? So we find no apnea, bradypnea, or cyanosis, so there is no life-threatening event. Then we'll assess the CBC of this baby. We assess the consciousness and we find this baby appears to be drowsy. There is increased work of breathing, and there is chest indrawing. And for those who have your audio on, there is a grunt which is present. And if you look at the color appears to be little dusky. So what do you think is this? Is this a respiratory or a circulatory problem? To begin with, we find that this appears to be primarily a respiratory problem. There is increased respiratory rate, there is chest indrawing, and obviously we need to do auscultate this baby to find the breath sounds, air entry. But obviously, looking at this baby, the severity we can easily grade to say this baby has respiratory distress, maybe going into impending respiratory failure. And as of now, the baby, except for the dusky hue, we need to also assess the heart rate, capillary free time, pulses, which would tell us whether there is coexisting compensated shock, or if the blood pressure is low, we would put it as hypotensive shock. Now, obviously, looking at the baby, if you have to find the etiology, we know this is a term baby, and this baby appears quite fresh. The cord is still there, so this baby is in first few hours of life. And then, based on the risk factors, whether it's meconium stain liquor, whether there's history suggestive of perinatal asphyxia, whether there is history suggestive of sepsis, your differential diagnosis now narrows down. So your clinical assessment bedside would help you come to a huge number of conclusions. Further, presence of grunt here tells you that this is an alveolar pathology, and that is how you would start making an approach whenever henceforward you see a newborn with respiratory distress. Well, what is the drug that you use when you find such a newborn? Obviously, you have to stabilize this baby, and the first drug that is used in the stabilization is oxygen. Now, we do know that there are various ways which we can give oxygen, and obviously the commonest is the use of nasal prongs. When we were residents, we had an option of using nasopharyngeal delivery, and the other option was of using oxygen hood. But by and large, now we realize that the use of nasopharyngeal oxygen is out. Oxygen hood again today has limited role, for we do know that it has to be used judiciously, and the oxygen concentration obviously is quite less when we talk in terms of nasal prongs versus when we talk in terms of oxygen hood. So it will decide based on the severity of the underlying illness as to what would be yours of respiratory support device. Mind you, this is not feasible practical in preterms, and we have two good options in terms of heated, humidified, high flow oxygen therapy, and second is the use of continuous positive airway pressure, and we'll talk about it later. The key point here is, when do we use humidification? Well, there are few situations where if you anytime cross the pharynx, you would want humidification to be a priority. If anytime you are using more than 2 liters per minute of oxygen, you would want the oxygen to be humidified. And bearing emergency situation for first few minutes, thereafter, anytime the oxygen therapy is going to be prolonged, it has to be warm and humidified. And therefore, humidification is a key factor which will make your oxygen work well. And having said that, the next question that you need to understand are few foundation facts. And these are in the terms of understanding how we would be interpreting oxygen clinically and how do we make the most of it based on our pathophysiological understanding. The first concept is that of FiO2, that is fraction of inspired oxygen. This is the amount of oxygen that is present in the inspired air of this newborn. Obviously, if this newborn is in room air, we would say the FiO2 is 21%. And we have this oxygen analyzer, which can help us identify an FiO2 in the newborn. What else can we do clinically? We can also assess the PaO2, that is partial pressure of oxygen. This is the amount of oxygen that is dissolved in the plasma. And we can measure PaO2 by means of arterial blood gas. We can also measure the oxygen saturation, and this is possible, feasible by means of a pulse oximeter. The SpO2 is nothing but the amount of oxygen that binds to the hemoglobin molecule. And lastly, what we cannot measure as clinicians is oxygen content of blood. And oxygen content of blood obviously is partial pressure of oxygen, that is PaO2, and a combination of oxygen saturation, which by mathematical calculations, we would be able to identify what is the oxygen content. But as a clinician, we are concerned about is oxygen delivery, that is DaO2. Again, we can make a surrogate understanding about the oxygen delivery, but we don't have any clinical device bedside which we can help to understand the oxygen delivery. So what are the factors which would help you in making optimize your therapy to a newborn who has respiratory distress? So just starting oxygen is not enough, for we will soon realize that your oxygen saturation is influenced by your oxygen dissociation curve. Remember, this is a sigmoid shaped curve, and it has 4 components which influence or shift the curve to the right or to the left. And these are pH, temperature, carbon dioxide, and diphosphoglycerate. Now, these are key factors. So if your pH, temperature, carbon dioxide are not addressed, your oxygen saturation would be not a complete evaluation. The oxygen content of the blood would be influenced by the hemoglobin. And therefore, optimizing hemoglobin is also an equally important aspect when it comes to optimizing hypoxic care. And last but not the least, your oxygen delivery in addition will be influenced by cardiac output. So what are the tools or clues to a clinician? We have 3 markers: FiO2, PaO2, SpO2. The FiO2 and SpO2 are non-invasive markers. PaO2 is an invasive marker bedside. It gives you a snapshot, one-time assessment of oxygen in the blood. But it is not enough to know these. You should be able to optimize your oxygen content by ensuring that there is adequacy in terms of hemoglobin and your oxygen delivery, which would therefore say that your cardiac output has to be adequate. And therefore, my initial assessment when I said that whether it is primarily a respiratory or a circulatory pathology or a combination of both, that means that management of concomitant shock is equally important. And here fluids, your inotropes would take an equally important measure as much as just giving oxygen is. So if you have understood this baseline concept of your what exactly are we trying to look at when we are looking at these bedside monitors, and how do we optimize the oxygen delivery, and therefore this is one of the foundation principles that would help you as a clinician to make the most in terms of optimizing the hypoxic care of a newborn. Well, we talked about PaO2, that is partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. We can also, by some calculations, understand what is alveolar partial pressure of oxygen. And roughly, if I have to say, it's an estimate uh, uh, of 700 into FiO2 minus PCO2. So you can easily identify what is alveolar arterial oxygen gradient and help um, track these indices, which will identify whether the baby is the same, whether it's improving, or whether it's deteriorating. And the indices which usually is applied when the baby is on some form of respiratory support, it is the oxygenation index, where we look at the mean airway pressure into FiO2 into 100 divided by partial pressure of oxygen. So these two are formulas which will help you clinically put oxygen therapy right there, trying to understand exactly as to what is the cause of hypoxia and how do we interpret it, looking at the trend to say, is the baby the same, whether the baby is improving or whether it is deteriorating. Well, where is the blender which is happening? The blender which is happening is in the oxygen blender. Why? Simply because when we want to titrate oxygen therapy, it is not in terms of liters or flow of oxygen that will matter. It will matter in terms of FiO2. And the way by which you would be able to titrate FiO2 is by using an oxygen blender. So an exact dose of oxygen can be delivered looking at 30%, 40%, 60%. And this is now, as far as majority of our centers are concerned, especially the delivery room, this is what you can say a gap or a lacune when it comes to delivery of oxygen. And what it also demands is you should have compressed air and oxygen to run this blender. And this is something which we need to invest for. Simply today, giving oxygen without a blender is not a scientific way to deliver oxygen. If I were to ask you, how do we optimize oxygen therapy without any medications? Well, we need to ensure normothermia, avoid hypothermia, avoid hyperthermia. We need to ensure gentle handling, minimize pain, ensure adequacy in terms of change of posture periodically, and make the stay of the newborn as comfortable as possible. And there are several ways and means by which we can do so. And this is incorporated in one word, that is developmentally supportive care. We need to ensure that oxygenation is not enough. We must ensure normoglycemia, normocalcemia, normotension, and correction of concomitant hypoxia, bleeding, anemia, and or acidosis is equally important. So what we now start realizing is that management of oxygen is not enough in terms of giving oxygen, but it appears to be quite more in terms of optimizing the oxygen content, optimizing the oxygen delivery, looking at multiple interventions simultaneously to ensure that we be able to give the most appropriate care. And whenever we talk about giving oxygen, which is the first drug in terms of stabilization of any newborn with respiratory distress, the key word here is monitoring. It would be unthinkable today that you would start oxygen without a monitor on this newborn. So how do we now optimize our monitoring? So what we are essentially talking about is a syndromic approach to the care of a newborn with respiratory distress. In the first slide, we talked about a generalized approach to identify quickly, asking few 4 or 5 pinpoint questions, and trying to do the most. Is the newborn sick, and is it primarily a respiratory or circulatory pathology? And then we said the first drug that we would give to stabilize this newborn is oxygen. And now we would say that how do we optimize our monitoring when it comes to oxygen therapy? Well, the non-invasive bedside tool that each one of us has access to is the pulse oximeter. Just word of caution that your regular pulse oximeter may find it difficult to detect the readings. It may take few precious minutes before it starts displaying. So what is expected of us is that in the delivery room, one would use signal extraction technology based pulse oximeter. How do I make the most of the pulse oximeter? I do not rely on my clinical assessment to identify hypoxia. By the time I have made a diagnosis of hypoxia based on change in color, it is too late. So the first and foremost is you would be able to identify hypoxia quickly if you are on this monitor. Then I find that the baby cries and the oxygen saturation varies. What I have picked up is a labile hypoxia, and this is my first clue to say, am I dealing with underlying pulmonary vascular pathology? And then for every baby with respiratory distress, I make it a habit to put a pulse oximeter probe on the right upper arm, upper limb. So it gives me a preductal oxygen saturation. And then I put also on the lower limb, so it gives me a postductal oxygen saturation. And when I find that there is a difference of more than 10% between the upper and the lower limb, that is preductal, postductal, I have made a diagnosis of differential cyanosis. And then when I find that the lower limb oxygen saturation is more than the upper limb, that is a reverse of the first, what we have is a reverse differential cyanosis. And now I know where the shunt pathology is in this baby. And last but not the least, the baby appears to be dusky, but the oxygen saturations continue to be lingering at the lower zone, but the baby is symptomatic. And even if I administer oxygen, there doesn't seem to be any much of influence. I am looking at an abnormal hemoglobin in this baby. And last but not the least, the pulse perfusion would be reflected by the waveforms, and therefore there is huge amount of information that we can gauge looking at this bedside tool, which usually we just glance at it without making most of it. What else? We need to look at the trend. So what it means is if there is a change which is happening, so even if it was a change which was of not more than 5 in terms of oxygen saturation, though it may be in the normal range, now I know that that baby may be in fact deteriorating. Well, if you know how to make the most of it, you must also know what this machine will not tell you. This machine will not tell you whether the baby is hyperoxic. What does it mean? Your saturations anytime when are beyond 95, the oxygen in the blood could be extending anywhere from 100 to 300, 400. So this is not a good way to detect hyperoxia. Further, we just said that we don't know clinically as of now to identify oxygen content and oxygen delivery of, and therefore that would not be detected by the pulse oximeter. Abnormal hemoglobins like methemoglobin would come in the way of interpretation. For we said that the SpO2, that the oxygen saturation, we said there were 4 markers which influence your oxygen dissociation curve. And obviously everyone is aware, a baby who is agitated, a baby who is exposed to light or who has poor perfusion would have difficulty in terms of display of saturations. And here a pulse oximeter based on signal extraction technology comes handy. So we need to keep in mind the limitations of this equipment before we go forwards. And last but not the least, all these equipment of pulse oximeter, once it is put, must have an upper and a lower oxygen saturation alarm limit set. That will be telling me I have optimized the use of oxygen monitoring in this newborn. And these are suggested oxygen saturation targets based on the underlying clinical condition of this baby. And this is how you could make the most in terms of your syndromic approach in terms of identifying the sick newborn, identifying the need for administration of oxygen therapy, and making the most in terms of your bedside clinical tool of pulse oximeter. So having understood some of these basic fundamentals, let me walk you through common scenarios that you would come across and what are the learning messages we shall look at. Well, this was a newborn who was term 2.5 kg, delivered by a cesarean section for a mother who had severe PIH. The baby established respiration and cry, but few minutes down the line, the baby starts grunting. What is the best action you would take? Start oxygen, administer CPAP, wait and watch, for we know some of the babies may have this, it will disappear, or you would do none of the above. Well, what do you think would be the most appropriate way to manage this newborn? Obviously, starting oxygen to this baby without doing a clinical assessment is not enough. This is a term newborn, and again, just starting CPAP will not be the correct way by which you would manage this newborn. Wait and watch would lead to probably deterioration, for we need to act quickly. And therefore, the correct answer is none of the above. And let me explain. Well, the key under-recognized, underappreciated uh, aspect in the delivery room is hypothermia. And as a quality marker, it is recommended that before, during, and after resuscitation, you would document temperature of all the newborns before they leave the delivery room. Why? Hypothermia is a silent killer. It is common, very common, especially in low birth weight babies. And studies have time and again shown that even in best of setups, almost up to a tune of 40 to 60% of these preterms and low birth weight babies may end up with hypothermia. And to my mind, hypothermia is not because of lack of equipments. It is because of our ignorance. Hypothermia also has been found to be an independent predictor of mortality. And there is a dose response relationship with hypothermia with clinical outcomes. For every 1 degree Celsius drop in temperature below 35.5 degrees Celsius, the mortality increases to a tune of about 28%. And hypothermia is associated with comorbidities, respiratory distress, hypoglycemia, predisposition for sepsis. And therefore, anytime you find any such babies who have any problems in the delivery room, you would start with ABC, of course, but in newborns, it is TABC. So the first is get this baby under the warmer. If not, ensure that the baby is under servo control, ensure the baby is normothermia, because many a times a hypothermic baby would start grunting and you would wonder why this baby is not improving. And then you would do a quick suction to ensure there is patency of the airway, suctioning first the mouth, then the nose, and then assessing this baby by putting a pulse oximeter on the right upper limb to identify the preductal oxygen saturation. Mind you, the lower limbs maybe accidentally where you would put on the pulse oximeter, and you would be making an error in terms of your assessment. And last but not the least, understand that if you want to start oxygen in the delivery room, it has to be based on minute specific oxygen saturation, which is applicable for both term and preterms. And the key factor here is that it may take up to 10 minutes for the oxygen saturations to reach 90%. So based on your preductal oxygen minute specific saturations, in this baby who started grunting, in this clinical way, by first assessing the temperature, then the airway, looking for good spontaneous respiratory efforts, and then putting the baby onto a pulse oximeter, would one decide the further care of this newborn. Let's move to the another case. This was a 2.5 kg term baby, LACS, who was born to mother with PIH. The baby established spontaneous respiration and cry. Obviously, you do a quick assessment and you are about to leave the delivery room when the staff rushes back to you to say, this baby is suddenly become blue and is gasping. You start positive pressure ventilation on this newborn and you find that the cyanosis worsens. Obviously, your positive pressure ventilation is ineffective, and therefore you try to take ventilation corrective measures in the form of MR followed by SO followed by PA, mask repositioning of the airway, suctioning, increasing, opening the airway, increasing the pressure, and then you intubate this baby, and suddenly drastically you find the baby improves. What is your clinical diagnosis? And this is how uh, your, I would say, alarm bell should ring as to why did this baby deteriorate despite positive pressure ventilation. Well, what you are likely to have this as an underlying cause. Is it that this was a baby with asphyxia? Is it a cyanotic heart disease? Or is it an airway problem? Or is it none of the above? Well, this baby had established respiration initially, but few minutes later down the line became blue. So obviously this baby was not asphyxiated. Cyanotic heart rarely presents in the delivery room. Airway anomalies do not worsen uh, just with bag and mask. So this is a condition which is worsening on bag and mask resuscitation. And I was told that bag and mask is a life-saving measure. And this is where you make a diagnosis of congenital diaphragmatic hernia. So to me, a textbook would say that a congenital diaphragmatic hernia comes with a scaphoid abdomen, shift of mediastinum, feeble heart sounds, decreased air entry, tympanic uh, on percussion. You would probably hear the vowel sounds. These appear good in textbook, but very rarely you would be able to appreciate there in the delivery room in this newborn who has suddenly deteriorated. As you start bag and mask, this baby further deteriorates simply because you are pushing more air, pushing more of the bowel into the thoracic cavity, and thereby worsening the cyanosis. Mind you, this baby got well simply because you intubated, and that is how this should ring alarm bells whenever you have such a baby in the delivery room, which deteriorates on bag and mask resuscitation. And obviously, this was a congenital diaphragmatic hernia. But good centers would give you a prenatal diagnosis. And time and again, we have burnt our fingers. Multiple sonographies done, found to be normal, only to have this problem detected postnatally, or a prenatal diagnosis is therefore an ideal but not always feasible or practical in our setups for multiple reasons. So if you have this baby with congenital diaphragmatic hernia, the story here is not over to say we hand it over to the surgeons. Congenital diaphragmatic hernia is a medical emergency. It is not a surgical emergency. You need to stabilize this baby in the first 48 hours and then uh, do a good assessments and then hand it over. Having a hemodynamic of babies with congenital diaphragmatic hernia would have underlying vertebral, anorectal, cardiac, tracheoesophageal, renal, or limb anomaly. And therefore, it is mandatory that you should do a vectoral search for all these newborns before you move on for handing it over to the surgeon. So if you have a baby with respiratory distress in the delivery room, what you see and what you hear will make a huge difference. So a trained eye will look at large capute, which will tell you that this was a difficult delivery. A frothing at mouth will tell you that this is underlying tracheoesophageal fistula. Micrognathia is telling you probably you are dealing with a Pair-Robin sequence. A craniofacial anomaly is telling you that you are looking at an upper airway anomaly. Hypotonia, which may be drug-induced, or maybe because of an underlying neuromuscular illness. Presence of bruises will tell you that this was a difficult delivery, and you would anticipate a problem in terms of whether there's associated brachial plexus injury with involvement of the diaphragm. The generalized anasarca will tell you there is a probability that there is a pleural effusion in this baby. Single umbilical artery could be a clue to you to say there's an underlying tracheoesophageal fistula which is sitting there. And obviously, meconium staining is not uncommon despite all our advances. So a head to toe structured, organized assessment of what you see will help you identify and localize as to what probably is the underlying problem. Simultaneously, you need to ask for associated risk factors which would direct you to the underlying etiology in the form of maternal medications, illnesses, presence of oligo or polyhydramnios, more importantly, antenatal steroids if you're dealing with a preterm delivery, risk factors for fetal distress, asphyxia, and presence or absence of a precipitate or traumatic delivery. Well, time and again you would have a baby who would be otherwise having difficulty in securing breathing component. So what do you do when a newborn continues to be apneic and you are struggling to identify the cause? I have what I call it as an ABC approach during resuscitation. The first problem I ask is there a problem with ability to secure airway? That means I'm unable to secure the airway. That means I'm looking at an upper airway anomaly. This could be a subglottic stenosis, atresia, web, or a ring which is coming in the way and therefore not giving me access to the upper airway. I can get an access to the airway, but whatever breaths I'm giving are not leading to a rising chest. So I am unable to provide effective breaths. So am I dealing with a severe lung disease? Could be because of a meconium aspiration, pneumonia, or a respiratory distress syndrome, or is it with a hypoplastic lung that I am looking at? I can secure the airway, I can deliver the breath, but it is not giving me improvement in terms of color. So am I dealing with a problem of circulation, which is arising either because of a cyanotic heart disease, or is it a PPHN, or is it a shock which is setting in? And therefore, an ABC approach to a difficult resuscitation, obviously ensuring normothermia, is the way forward. And therefore, your approach in the respiratory room should have some toolkits when you assess these babies. Obviously, what you have here is a micrognathia. This may be leading to underlying glossoptosis, narrowing of the airway, and maybe with an associated cleft, and then we would put it as a Perry-Robbins syndrome. When you have a problem with the mouth, the solution is in the nose, so you have to put in a nasopharyngeal tube to relieve the respiratory distress in such newborns. For those babies who have cyanosis, which is relieved on crying, what you have is either an inability to put in a feeding tube per nostril. Probably you're dealing with either a membranous or a bony form of choanal atresia. Mind you, the bony form of choanal atresia is the severest form, and it may be unilateral, it may be bilateral, and the membranous form of choanal atresia may present anytime from the delivery room up to infancy, and a high index of suspicion is required, simply because, see, the babies with cyanotic heart disease, when you cry, they become blue. And this is a baby, when it cries, the cyanosis disappears. So this is the clue to you here, in addition to inability to pass a feeding tube per nostril, to say you are dealing with a choanal atresia. Now remember, here the problem is in the nose, and the solution here is to get in a oropharyngeal airway. And lastly, when you can't intubate, you can't perform because of, say, a inexpertise or in form of a craniofacial anomaly, you would make use of a laryngeal mask airway. And what has happened new here is a neo-eye gel, what you can say, an advanced form of laryngeal mask airway, where here you would inflate air to get it fixed onto the glottis. Here, when it comes in contact with the warm upper airway, this dissolves and takes a shape to get it, what you can say, fixed in the glottis, and you could then put in ventilation through this airway device. But this is quite handy. It is applicable. Laryngeal mask airway is applicable beyond 34 weeks of age, but it is not meant for administration of drugs or administration for chest compressions, where you would preferably intubate these babies. So if you have to have this baby who is otherwise well and is about to be discharged from home from the delivery room, which usually happens by 24 hours in majority of the centers, and you don't want this baby to end up back, it is mandatory that we would screen these newborns by a pulse oximeter at 24 hours of age and beyond. If the oxygen saturation exceeds 95% and the upper lower limb difference is less than 3%, we would say the possibility of critical congenital heart defect in this baby is next to none. However, if you find the oxygen saturation less than 90%, we would say this has failed the screening, and you would subject this baby to a cardiology expertise. At times, when the oxygen saturation is between 90 to 95%, you would repeat the test. And if you continue to have the same results, you would repeat the test after another 1 hour to say whether it has passed or whether it has failed. So this is a good screening tool to identify critical congenital heart defects. Mind you, it has limitations, and a past test does not assure you that there would not be an underlying heart disease, but something which could be of great significance in terms of providing quality care to all our newborns. So what have been the messages from the delivery room? Hypothermia is a silent killer. We must learn to document temperature for all the newborns before we leave the delivery room. we must ensure that we do look at the preductal oxygen saturation in the first hour of life. Always make an attempt to identify risk factors perinatal, which will give you a clue to the cause of respiratory distress. And we shall soon learn that one of the ways by which we could stabilize, in addition to oxygen in the delivery room, is CPAP. And last but not the least, all difficult things in the delivery room must have a structured and organized approach in the form of temperature, airway, breathing, and circulation. So let's move gears and shift to another case. Well, this was a term 2.5 kg baby, difficult birth, details are not known, and the baby at 1 hour of age has come to our hospital. What do you find? You find that the baby is breathing fast. You find that there is subcostal indrawing. And what is striking is that this baby is term, this baby is in the first few minutes after life. And you find that what is striking here, as you see the baby from the side, is an increased anteroposterior diameter, what is called as the barrel-shaped chest. And obviously, you find meconium staining, you have made a diagnosis of meconium aspiration syndrome in this newborn. Now, this is very classical. And mind you, there are two elements which would make you worry when you see a baby with meconium. A, you confirm by looking at the X-ray and you find that there are bilateral diffuse opacifications telling you that both the lungs are involved and meconium aspiration syndrome has set in. What is equally important is learn to anticipate problems and complications in this baby. The first and foremost is this baby goes on to continuous monitor, and you look at the oxygen saturations. And we said that when we find the oxygen saturations fluctuating, we identify it as labile oxygenation. And then you would find at times that there is a difference in between the upper and the lower limb, and you have made a diagnosis of differential hypoxia. And despite giving 100% oxygen, come what may, the oxygen saturations fail to go beyond 90. You have looked at is refractory hypoxia. Now, in low resource settings, this is all you would be able to make out unless you do a 2D echo and then run the further course of care for this baby. And the dreaded complication, which would make things difficult, is PPHN, that is pulmonary hypertension of the newborn, and that is what we are trying to make out. So all babies with meconium aspiration syndrome must have minimal handling. They must be judiciously sedated, provided adequate analgesia, have a target oxygen saturation, ensure that you track and maintain the mean blood pressure, and you may need to give fluids or maybe even start inotropes. And we also realize that these babies, when they have labile oxygenation or go on to develop refractory hypoxia, obviously it would be too little and too late. So in situations where your ventilatory support exceeds beyond PIP of 25, you would consider high frequency oscillation. And we talked about oxygenation index, and we start tracking the oxygenation index. And from conventional ventilation to high frequency to inhaled nitric oxide, obviously is the journey of PPHN. And you would start tracking in addition to provide a good milieu environment and try to establish homeostasis. And this would be a brief, what you can say, at a glance care, but the definitive care will be based on a 2D echo management where you document normal heart, you document that there is obviously an increased pulmonary vascular pressure. You have made all efforts in terms of ventilation to optimize the PEEP, consider maybe a surfactant, and then take a call based on a such or a similar algorithm as to how you would manage this newborn. Well, this is a topic by itself, but just a glance at how these things can be managed with a baby with meconium aspiration who goes on to develop PPHN. The second dreaded complication is sudden deterioration. And what you have here is a tension pneumothorax setting in this baby with meconium aspiration. So you have an underlying collapsed lung. There is air which has accumulated beyond the lung. There is depression of the ipsilateral diaphragm and the reshift of the mediastinum. And this has happened suddenly. So what you have here is a tension pneumothorax. The intervention of choice here is to put an intercostal drainage at the earliest. At times, you may also have what would be that there will be air which gets accumulated in the mediastinum, which pushes the thymus up. So this is a pneumomediastinum. And at times, there is a halo which also is seen along the inferior border of the heart. This is a pneumopericardium. And these are spectrum of air leak syndromes that you would see in a baby with meconium aspiration syndrome. If you are in low resource settings and you suspect an air leak, you would put in a needle in the second intercostal space, document air bubbles, and say you are dealing with a pneumothorax, confirm it by means of an X-ray. But if you have access to cold light source, you would quickly identify in a non-invasive manner to say this baby needs intervention which goes beyond just management in terms of meconium aspiration syndrome. So what you have here is a bilateral air leak, and this baby would need bilateral intercostal drain. So what are the lessons learned after the delivery room? The second commonest problem that you would face is babies with respiratory distress with meconium aspiration syndrome. And to me, presence of grunt, we said, is an alveolar pathology. That means meconium has trickled down into the alveoli. That is an ominous sign. Anticipate complications. Similarly, a barrel-shaped chest in a baby with respiratory distress tells you a significant in utero asphyxia has set in, and again, anticipate problems and complications in these babies. Aggressive supportive care is must. Anticipate PPHN, anticipate air leaks, and labile oxygenation is what would be the first if you don't have 2D echo on this. And last but not the least, lung recruitment by giving adequacy in terms of PEEP is must. And there are different ways and means of ventilation strategies that I would not go into details, which will help you optimize your care for this baby. And a sudden deterioration is an air leak syndrome in such babies. So that was at a glance what we would, as clinicians, look at, anticipate, and care for a baby with meconium aspiration syndrome. Well, let's move to another case scenario where we now have a 34-weeker, 2.5 kg LSCS baby born to a primary with severe PIH, received 1 dose of dexamethasone. The baby established cry, but few minutes later starts grunting. And what you have, and which has changed, the management here is having ensured the normothermia of babies today with respiratory distress in the delivery room would be supported by means of providing adequacy in terms of oxygenation and peak and expiratory pressure by means of a T-piece resuscitator, what is called as delivery room CPAP. Now, you would soon realize that look at this model of preterm pup, rabbit pup, and you find that this baby, this preterm lung of the rabbit has been just given PIP. And few breaths later, you would be able to see the aeration in this lung which is happening. Now, in contrast, look at this lung where in addition to the PIP, PEEP is being given, and you would soon find that there is a huge difference in terms of aeration which happens. And based on the animal studies and thereafter number of newborn studies, delivery room CPAP became standard of care when it comes to supporting respiratory distress in the delivery room. So the message here is if you are on a preterm newborn resuscitation and you need bag and mask, preferably use peak and expiratory pressure. Question is, what would be the best predictor for developing respiratory distress syndrome in this baby? X-ray chest, shake test, Downey score, blood gas. Remember, your clinical assessment outscores. X-ray may not correlate with your severity of the lung disease. Shake test has poor sensitivity and specificity. Blood gas obviously will take some time and not may be feasible. And your clinical assessment by means of a respiratory score is what we are interested in in identifying and grading the severity of respiratory distress. We have two scores, the Downey score and the Silverman-Anderson score. The Downey score is the simplest form where we look at the respiratory rate, cyanosis, air entry, grunt, and retraction, and can be used for both term and preterms, versus the Silverman-Anderson score, which is predominantly meant for preterms. Now, irrespective of which score you use, there are two practical tips. A, look at the trend. One-time assessment is not enough. Second, interpret looking at the infant's general status. By that I mean sensorium. So if a baby score is 7 to begin with and has now become 3, that baby is improving. That's one way by which you would look at this baby. But if you have understood that you would assess the baby looking at the sensorium and the score has dropped from 7 to 3 and the baby is now drowsy, that means this baby is worsening. So what it means is, in isolation, the score is not enough. Look at the trend, look at the oxygen saturations in addition, and interpret it with the sensorium. So what would be your best way by which you would manage this baby? Start oxygen, give CPAP, consider high flow nasal cannula, or intubate and give surfactant and ventilate. Well, we realize that the standard of care we said today was to start with delivery room CPAP, and for all newborns, preterms in particular, who develop respiratory distress, we would start CPAP for all those with a respiratory distress Downey score of 3 or more, or requiring oxygen requirement more than 30%. And you would intubate, administer surfactant, extubate, and go back to CPAP, what is called as ensure, if anytime your oxygen saturation requirement, somebody would say 30%, some would say 40%, and you would then administer surfactant to this baby with ongoing continuing your support. So this baby is intubated, you administer the first dose of surfactant, go back, that there would be some babies who would not benefit from CPAP, and we must know when to get out of this non-invasive respiratory support. Anytime you find that the CPAP pressures exceed 8, or your oxygen requirement is more than 70%, or the baby shows cardiorespiratory instability, we know that this baby is not going to be tolerating CPAP. So the key point for CPAP is that the baby should be breathing spontaneously. Can we predict which babies will fail on CPAP? Well, this was a study which came from Murki et al. And if you had a whiteout X-ray on admission, your Downey scores continued to be beyond 7 within the first 2 hours of your respiratory support. Within 2 hours of your starting CPAP, your oxygen requirement climbed beyond 50. These were predictors of CPAP failure. And anytime there were comorbid conditions like associated PDA, IVH, sepsis, shock, these babies would fail on CPAP. The key point again is, unlike West, your lung maturity plays a big role, and therefore a complete course of steroids to threatened preterm labor, less than 34 weeks of gestation, is standard of care. If this has been missed, or if it is partial, obviously the baby is going to come out with moderate to severe variety of respiratory distress syndrome, and it's very likely that your non-invasive respiratory support will not work. Well, today we have moved beyond ensure, and there are ways and means by which you would overcome intubation, for which you realize that this is invasive procedure associated with its own hazard. You could administer surfactant by means of a orogastric tube, a special catheter, or maybe a laryngeal mask airway. And the key point here is you do not have to intubate the baby. You just put in the catheter, administer surfactant with the CPAP, which is ongoing, versus we saw where you had to discontinue when the surfactant was being administered with the ensure technique. And using LISA or MIST, less invasive surfactant administration or minimally invasive surfactant therapy, has been found to reduce the need for mechanical ventilation, and is the single most factor which has been found to identify reducing the incidence and severity of chronic lung disease and reducing mortality. There are some concerns and there is a learning curve, and we need to address these issues if you want LISA or MIS to become standard of care in your unit. What about high flow nasal cannula? A very attractive option compared to CPAP. The drawback of CPAP being intensive nursing care, but mind you, this heated humidified high flow nasal cannula is an attractive option for babies beyond 28 weeks of gestation as a primary respiratory support, though the evidence is not forthcoming, but many units would use it. For babies less than 28 weeks, obviously it is not a standard of care. And compared to CPAP, there is no difference in terms of rates of death or chronic lung disease. There's a lesser risk of nasal trauma and or air leak, but for very preterms, the need for respiratory support was found to be higher for high flow nasal cannula. So this is a simple and attractive alternative to CPAP, but the problem with HFNC is we do not know and we cannot regulate the amount of positive and expiratory pressure that is being generated and that is being delivered. But this is not labor intensive in terms of nursing care, which makes it very attractive. Well, what are the implications to us as clinicians? Now, if we look at this study, the point is if you have babies with preterm and you want to save most of them, they will be saved with administration of continuous positive airway pressure, surfactant, and a very small would end up requiring mechanical ventilation. This is again a study showed about 4 simple strategies: place of delivery, antenatal steroids, hypothermia management, and early surfactant and CPAP. Now, these 4 interventions in 11 European countries were looked at, and they found that all these 4 interventions were feasible and practiced only up to 60% of the times. What it means is there is a huge gap between what we know and what we do. And therefore, a bundle of care right from the delivery room and looking at temperature, ensuring antenatal steroids, early CPAP, early rescue surfactant is the key if we have to save and manage newborns with respiratory distress syndrome. Well, obviously it's a team effort, and babies with respiratory distress would require, in addition to respiratory support, asepsis, nutrition. And what does team stands for? Together, everyone achieves more. And towards the end, look at this baby who has fast breathing. If we do a CBC of this baby, we find that the consciousness of this baby is alert. The baby is breathing fast, but there is not much indrawing. There is a heaving type of breathing. There are no audible sounds, and the color appears to be otherwise pink. So this baby has respiratory distress, but it is predominantly tachypnic and not much of indrawing. What you are dealing here is metabolic acidosis, and here the management is not in terms of optimizing oxygenation and ventilation alone, but treat the cause. And there are a number of ways and means by which metabolic acidosis can set in. We need to address one or more of these which may exist in this newborn, and that would optimize the care. Well, last case, 2.5 kg, day 6, no risk factors, comes with poor feeding. You find the baby has tachycardia, tachypnea, chest indrawing is not much. The blood pressure is maintained, but you find that despite oxygenation, the saturations do not exceed beyond 85%. X-ray chest shows not much of parenchymal pathology. There is no murmur. So anytime you have this kind of deterioration with progressive hypoxia, oxygen, heart defect. The first and foremost here is to start prostaglandin infusion pending confirmation with 2D echo. A high index of suspicion, therefore, is mandatory when you are dealing with these. My plea is, how do I pick up a heart disease without a murmur? And this is where a clinical assessment is. Obviously, when the oxygen saturation is less, and then you pick up a heart disease, it may be too little, too late. Presence of a murmur does not always tell you a heart disease. Many a times you would have a murmur, but no heart disease. And certain things which are very common on history which should alert you to a possibility of underlying heart disease as a cause is a poor rest cycle, a cyanosis which is aggravated on crying, a poor weight gain or excessive weight gain in a baby who was hospitalized tells you that something is going wrong with the heart. But as a clinician, I take much of interest in assessing the second heart sound. By 24 to 48 hours, the second heart sound should split. If it is single, it tells me there is something wrong in terms of transition from in utero to ex utero. A single second heart sound beyond 48 hours is a heart disease unless proved otherwise. Presence of congestive cardiac failure is most reliably reflected by unexplained hepatomegaly in the newborn. Presence of cardiomegaly goes in favor of an underlying heart disease. We said presence of a murmur is suggestive but not definitive. All babies who deteriorate suddenly must have forelimb blood pressure documented, and a differential blood pressure may be a clue to you to say that you are dealing with a left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. Differential cyanosis, we talked about looking at upper limb, lower limb, SpO2, presence of bounding pulses or absent pulses for that matter would be a clue to you to say that you are dealing either with an interrupted aortic arch or coarctation of aorta, and an unexplained hepatomegaly is CCF in the newborn unless proved otherwise. I look at all these subtle clues to say this is a heart disease. And once you have made a clinical impression, obviously you need to confirm it by means of 2D echo. So when would you think beyond respiratory cardiac causes for a cause for respiratory distress? To me, if the newborn shows an unanticipated, unexpected course, for example, RDS was supposed to improve by day 3, it continues to deteriorate, it should ring alarm bells. No anticipated response. I have given 2 doses of surfactant and the baby does not improve. Obviously, you are dealing with something else. Presence of a amniotic fluid anomaly could be the first marker to say you are dealing with an underlying make you search for associated other anomalies. Before I end, this was a baby who was otherwise having some tachypnea, but settled down only to have a space occupying lesion, which was identified. And then a CT was planned. What exactly is happening here? The baby is otherwise well. And what you have here is X-ray beam falling through the hole of the incubator, giving you a false impression of a space occupying lesion. This baby was otherwise well, X-ray was taken and it showed possibility of a small air leak and a possibility of pneumothorax was entertained. Obviously, what we fail to realize is this is extending beyond the lungs and this is a skin fold which is mimicking pneumothorax. So what have we learned? Look at the baby first before you look at any of the radiological markers. Few babies would benefit by doing an ultrasound chest. No doubt point of care ultrasound is the key in terms of sudden deterioration, and for that matter probably is replacing X-ray chest at multiple places. But to those where you don't have that skills, mind you would need an ultrasound for diagnosing a pleural disease to differentiate solid from cystic intrathoracic mass, to make a diagnosis of diaphragmatic excursion, and rarely you would need a CT thorax. Think in terms of anatomical site for a space occupying lesion in the chest to evaluate a mediastinal mass, or when you suspect a vascular ring. Let me end by saying no baby today with respiratory distress would fulfill all your criterias, and we need to think out of the box. And today that out of the box thinking is in terms of COVID-19. To me, COVID-19 would be suspected anytime if the newborn is febrile, is sick, but there are no risk factors, shows unexplained shock, shows unexplained deterioration, or where the onset of respiratory distress is after 48 hours of life, or I find there is multi-organ dysfunction syndrome in a newborn presenting beyond first 5 days of life, I would think in terms of COVID-19. And that is how short and brief way by which a clinician would approach to a newborn with respiratory distress. I think I will stop here and I would be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for that elaborative, to the point lecture and with multiple clinical tips. I think we all can take those tips and apply that into clinical practice. I have personally learned a lot from sir, being a student co-faculty, and I continue to still learn a lot. Thank you so much, sir. We have many questions, and to start with, Dr. Deepthi Bajaj has a question, sir. If a baby is hypoxic and arrives late to us on day one, when to suspect baby is going to PPHN and when to start sildenafil if they
Okay.
don't have an echo?
Yeah. If you have a baby who is cynosed and you find that this cyanosis is central cyanosis and you find that this is refractory cyanosis, despite giving 100% oxygen, the baby is not improving. And obviously your subtle clues that I talked about in terms of a congenital heart defect are not there. Possibility of PPHN remains. Would I give sildenafil? Well, uh, to treat without a diagnosis is hitting with bullets without knowing where the enemy is. And it's not what you can say standard by which you would be managing such babies. In fact, I would say you would err in starting prostaglandin on this baby rather than starting sildenafil. I can't hear you, Akash.
Sorry, sir. We have next question from Dr. Sushil. Can subcostal chest indrawing be a normal finding in very preterm or extreme preterm baby?
Correct. It could be. So also sternal indrawing.
Next question we have. What is the role of oxygen by hood in current clinical practice when there are multiple other non-invasive modes available?
Perfect. Hardly any.
Should we consider surfactant therapy in early preterm, 30 weeker, without any X-ray finding of RDS?
You don't need a X-ray to make a diagnosis of RDS. You don't need X-ray to administer your first dose of surfactant. You need an X-ray if your first dose of surfactant has not given the desired response, or where your differential diagnosis is beyond RDS.
Dr. Amit Suyal asks, very often in our clinical practice, we encounter babies with silent tachypnea. That is, they have only tachypnea without any labored respiration and have normal vitals. Will these babies qualify as respiratory distress, and do we need to put them on any respiratory support?
Okay. Well, the definition of respiratory distress includes two of the three: fast breathing, chest indrawing, and or grunt. So obviously a fast breathing in isolation is not pure filling into the definition of respiratory distress. If the baby is otherwise well, the oxygen saturations are being maintained, I would try to find out the underlying cause, because I said silent tachypnea could be a metabolic acidosis. It could also be a transient tachypnea of the newborn. So history, clinical examination should give you a clue. No active intervention if the baby is otherwise stable and has oxygen saturations which are well maintained.
Another question from Dr. Amit is, by transfusing adult packed RBCs in a sick anemic neonate, we tend to shift the ODC curve to the right, thus exposing the neonate to higher oxidative stress. By what measures can we negate this and keep the oxygen dissociation curve as physiological as possible?
Take care of hypothermia, hypoxia, acidosis, and reduce the pain. So all other issues which will matter, but there is no other option but to give an adult blood that we have.
Dr. Sushil asks, what will be the key points to differentiate clinically between cardiac and respiratory cause for respiratory distress in a setting where there is no echo available and we know that murmur can be functional in newborns?
Look at the upper limb, lower limb saturations. Look at the blood pressure. Look at the pulses. Look at the second heart sound. These are all clues to you to say you are dealing with a congenital heart defect. More importantly, if you have uh, ability to do a blood gas, now all of you are looking at PO2. I am looking at PCO2. PCO2 is high in a respiratory pathology. In heart diseases, usually, unless you end up with a terminal heart disease, your PCO2 is going to be low. So those are my clues to pick up a congenital heart disease.
Sometimes, because of the various IV cannulas or because of the various burn injuries, Dr. Amit asks, can we use earlobes for assessing preductal saturation?
Yes, feasible. Forehead pulse oximetry also is feasible.
Dr. Prashant asks that grunting is related to alveolar collapse, and hypothermia, we know that it will worsen the oxygenation or cause ventilation perfusion mismatch. But how does correction of temperature or suctioning reduce grunting?
Okay, if you see, hypothermia is also going to be associated, we said, with uh, your increased work of breathing. Hypoxia sets in, and this would be compensated by means of increased efforts by the baby. And obviously, one way by which your moderate to severe hypothermia sets in is it also deactivates your surfactant. It also would cause your ventilation perfusion mismatch to set in. Your hypoglycemia sets in, and again, your anaerobic metabolism sets in. So multiple ways by which you would have. So the message from that case was that it is easy to miss hypothermia simply because we don't make an attempt to look at it.
We have next question by Dr. Sushil on use of CPAP. Can we use CPAP if chest is hyperinflated in a case of meconium aspiration syndrome?
Okay. Yes, it is feasible, practicable, and in fact, the guidelines standard of care would demand that your first respiratory support is CPAP for both preterm and also term babies. And uh, no doubt, if you see the case series and literature which has come, one of the ways by which surfactant gets deactivated is by presence of meconium. So when you have a black, what you can say, a meconium aspiration where this underlying pathology is significantly surfactant inactivation, CPAP will work. A trap is worth giving, especially if you don't have a ventilator or till the time a specialist team comes to transfer this newborn. So it is feasible, practicable.
Dr. Jyoti wants to know what is labile oxygen, what is differential hypoxia, and what is refractory hypoxia.
Labile oxygen is your oxygen saturations fluctuating hugely, even if the baby has slight movement or the baby starts crying and you find that the saturations drops down to, say, from 95 drops down to 90. That is labile oxygenation. Your differential hypoxia is your upper limb has oxygen saturation more compared to the lower limb. This is more than 10%. If you have refractory hypoxia, what we mean is despite giving 100% oxygen, we are unable to drive the oxygen saturation beyond 90%. So that is indirectly telling you either you have respiratory failure or you have significant cyanotic heart disease.
Dr. Neeta Khanna, you are unmuted. You can ask your question. You can unmute and ask your question directly. Ma'am, are you there? We move to the next question again on silent tachypnea. Whether term babies who have silent tachypnea can be started on breastfeeding if they have no other abnormality of vitals or respiratory distress.
Not many of us would have the courage for a baby who is breathing fast. See, meconium aspiration babies will breathe fast. And by putting these babies to breastfeeding, they would exert to feed. So that is increased work of breathing for them. So those who are borderline hypoxic, in fact, will desaturate and deteriorate. So I would rather observe this baby, take a call, whether it's settling down rather than just because the baby is otherwise well. Many a times you would also have that it is an evolving pathology. Right now, at first go, you may not be able to come to a final diagnosis. So I would hesitate.
So we have discussed that preterm babies with score of more than 3 should be started on CPAP. What about those preterm babies who are less than 34 weeks and have score less than 3? Should they be started on CPAP or we should wait?
This is a clinical decision. And I would say rather than looking at a single score, look at the work of breathing, look at the oxygen requirement and take a call.
This question is from Dr. Subramaniam and it is regarding resuscitation. A baby who is otherwise normal but does not reach the target saturation by 10 minutes. Should we admit such babies and monitor, or should we take it as a normal?
Obviously, it tells you that there is some problem with oxygenation. Now, this problem of oxygenation could be isolated oxygen problem, or it could be because of an underlying ventilation problem, or a combination of both oxygenation and ventilation. All such babies need evaluation to identify the underlying cause.
Sir, this is from Boni. Should we use nasal prongs instead of mask in delivery room for delivering CPAP?
I think it could be feasible. The question is not the interface. The question is, are we able to give the desired peak and expiratory pressure? Now use any way, means, device, and it will work.
The last question is regarding use of HHFNC in delivery room. Can we use it?
Okay.
And shall we use blender in resuscitation in labor room?
Shall we? There's no shall. It is mandatory that we must use a blender in the delivery room. And that is what I called it as a blunder, which is happening with the blender in the delivery room. Today, morally, ethically, and scientifically, it is unacceptable to administer oxygen without a blender. So that is why, definitely, in the government of guidelines, when it comes to establishing an NICU, somehow this important piece of equipment has been missing. And therefore, many of the government medical colleges, and for that matter, delivery rooms, don't find this apparatus unless you have a neonatologist who has a eye for details, and then you start realizing that we were making a blunder. Second, should I use humidified high flow nasal cannula in the delivery room? Well, it is based on anecdotal evidence. It is not standard of care. And there are some studies, but as of now, neither any of the guidelines nor any of the resuscitation ILCOR guidelines talk about this, and therefore I would not use it. Anything which is experimental should be restricted to experimental studies only. It should not be put into clinical use unless its safety and efficacy has been documented. The first philosophy of newborn care always has been do no harm. We have made lots of blunders. We started with many of the interventions only to end up with problems later on. And if you look at all the prophylactic interventions which took place in neonatology, look at the Cochrane. I would say almost all the prophylactic interventions have been found to be of no use.
So next question is, if a baby on CPAP develops pneumothorax, can we continue after putting a chest drain? Because we know that CPAP is better than ventilation.
You can, it all depends upon the severity of the air leak and the gestation of the baby. In preterm, you may probably, very preterm, you may have to ventilate the baby, and therefore you need to take a call, but there is no harm if you can provide CPAP also.
Last question, sir. Term babies who often have TTNV with normal saturation, should we start them on oxygen by non-invasive mode or should we wait?
Well, the call for giving oxygen is not based only on your what you can say saturation. I would preferably look at the work of breathing, look at the air entry, look at the what you can say history and clinical codes. That will give me a clue as to what am I trying to look at in this baby. And starting oxygen is easy, but it's not that way. You must look at and document hypoxia before you start oxygen. So free flow oxygen, oxygen by prongs to all babies with breathing difficulty is not the correct way.
Thank you.
In the delivery room.
Thank you so much, sir, for lucidly explaining each and every point about use of respiratory support, both in delivery room as well as NICU. Sir, before we end, a few take-home messages for clinicians. Rishikesh, sir.
Okay, the first message is oxygen is a drug. It has a dose, it has an indication, and it has side effects, and it needs monitoring. That's the first message. The second is 80% of the times you would be able to identify the cause of your respiratory distress if you take a proper history and clinical examination. Technology is there as an adjunct to your clinical assessment, and it must be interpreted in toto rather in isolation. an abnormal test, as I showed, 2 X-rays, and for that matter, there would be a lot of such, but a normal baby should make you alert to a possibility of an error sitting in because of iatrogenesis rather than because of an underlying condition. The standard of care for stabilizing a baby with respiratory distress would be not oxygen, but using a CPAP or a heated humidified high flow nasal cannula. Uh, we must realize that there is a window of opportunity. The early the intervention, better is the outcome. And last but not the least, the management of respiratory distress is not in terms of oxygen alone. It needs assessment, simultaneously management of your hemoglobin, of your shock, of your temperature, of your blood sugar, of your uh, means of your metabolic status, and therefore look at it in toto rather than looking at it in isolation.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking time out of your busy schedule. And we all know how busy you are, and still making it and continuing it beyond 10 up to 10:30. Thank you so much, sir, for your time, efforts, and explaining each and every tidbit of respiratory support. Before we end, Bhatia, sir, your comments, please.
Dr. Rishikesh is excellent as always. So after he has taken lecture, hardly any comment can be made, no? Rishikesh?
Thank you very much, sir. The greatness of the man lies in his simplicity, and you have always shown us the way. And passive learning has happened a lot from you for me, and it has been a pleasure to interact with one and all. And thank you for your patience, simply to sit and learn on a Saturday evening when everybody would wanting to.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, sir. Indeed, I would love to listen again and again to you, sir, in near future. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bhatia, sir, for being with us. And thank you all the participants. Thank you, sir. Good night, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Bye. Take care.